Yo de lo que os voy a hablar esta tarde, que son de las unidades didácticas CLIL, espero que sean interesantes y sobre todo que os sea útil. Y como bien ha dicho Javier, bueno, estaré a vuestra disposición al final de la sesión para contestar a vuestras preguntas. Me voy a pasar a compartir pantalla para que veáis de lo que vamos a hablar hoy. So the title of today's session is Learning to Plan and Planning to Learn in a CLIL Context. As Javier said, all of you are professionals. I'm not going to teach you how to plan a lesson, but what I want you to bear in mind is that planning is vital. I'm going to show you the outline we are going to follow today. First of all, we are going to see what are the main differences between planning in the student's mother tongue, which is planning in the L1, versus planning in a second language, and especially planning in a CLIL context. We're going to talk about the challenges both teachers and students have to face when they have to learn content through a language which is not their mother tongue. And we are going to see some specific characteristics we have to take into consideration when we plan in a CLIL context, such as what kind of strategies we are going to provide our students with in order to help them access the content and access the language. Some examples of how to develop communication, some strategies you can use in your classroom in order to develop communication, and some other strategies we can use to develop cognition and critical thinking. And at the end, we're going to see an example of a geography lesson in which I will provide you with examples, with examples as well. So what are the main differences between planning in the L1 and planning in the L2? I'm not going to perhaps to teach you how to plan because, well, most of us or most of you are teachers, so you know how to do that. But we're going to see that sometimes even when we plan for our students in the L1, we take many things for granted and we assume that they know more things than they really do. So the main difference is, for example, when we are planning in the L1, in the student's mother tongue, they can use the language of learning. Of course, they all speak Spanish. They can talk without struggling with vocabulary and syntax. They can listen with reasonably understanding to people talking. I mean, they understand what the teacher is telling them, of course, depending on the topics and depending on the level of the students. They can read and write at least at a minimally skilled level. Of course, I'm just paying attention to very low levels of students, primary student levels. Of course, it is not the same a first grade student than a sixth grade student. But well, if we think about that, they can manage with a language. Then students have the everyday language in Spanish. I mean, they have the BICS, they have basic interpersonal communicative skills. I mean, they are able to speak face-to-face with other people. They are able to speak in familiar contents. They can use simple structures, simple sentences. They can use different sentences and structures. They can use high-frequency words. For example, these are very simple examples of high frequency. They know words like, for example, tarde, niño, nuevo, conocido, en cabeza. I mean, they have the language they need to communicate in familiar context or in familiar context. But sometimes something we forget, and that is what I was telling you at the beginning, we take for granted that they are able to do many other things in their mother tongue. And perhaps they cannot do that. For example, we cannot assume that they have all the academic language they need in order to access the content in Spanish. Perhaps they are not able to write in a formal way. Perhaps they are not able to understand many abstract concepts in their mother tongue. Perhaps they are not able to write very long or complex sentences. Or perhaps they don't know a lot of low frequency vocabulary. So we have, I showed you an example before about high frequency words like niño, tarde, cabeza, etc. But sometimes, do they really know words like crepúsculo, zagal, novel, mollera, they might not know that. And sometimes we assume that when we plan in the L1, I mean, we're not going to have any problems. And there are many things we have to take into consideration. So we cannot assume that they will be able to work through a problem in small groups, or perhaps they are not able to report their findings or what they do in an oral presentation. Talking about something which is not very familiar for them without difficulty. Are they able to define, classify, compare, contrast? I mean, do they have the necessary language in order to do all these other cognitive discourse functions they need in order to learn the content? Or use the vocabulary of school learning, I mean, the academic vocabulary they need in order to learn the content? Can they use a range of visuals, like, for example, graphs, charts, diagrams? So that's why I was telling you that sometimes we take things for granted and we think that, well, we can do that in Spanish, doing that in another language is difficult. But remember that sometimes they are not able to do many things. Now, what happens when we are planning in a second language? We must remember that students cannot speak without help. They won't be able to write sentences in a proper manner without making grammatical errors. They don't have a very wide range of vocabulary. Sometimes they lack vocabulary. Sometimes they have difficulties in understanding what the teacher is telling them or what the teacher says in the classroom. They are not fluent in the second language, and they are learning the second language, but sometimes at the same time they are learning the L1. They are also learning their mother tongue. So when we are planning in a second language, and especially in a CLIL context, we know that we have to, they are going to learn different content, which means new concepts, which means new language in order to express those concepts. And remember that each subject had a different language, or they have different concepts they have to learn. So they are still developing BICS. Remember that BICS is the ordinary language, the language they can use in normal situations, but it will be sometimes very difficult for them to develop the academic language they need. Because as I said before, new subject means new concepts. So when we plan for CLIL, this is one of the main differences. In the L1, normally we don't think about the language the students need in order to learn the content. That's something we don't think about because we assume or we suppose that they can do it with any problems. But for example, CLIL has a very specific pattern of teaching. So when we plan in a second language, and especially when we are planning with contents, with different subjects, there are many things we have to take into consideration in order to provide students with the necessary support so they will learn at the end. So when we are in a CLIL program, both teachers and students have to face a lot of challenges, and we are going to have a look at some of them. So the teacher have to be prepared to present and explain new concepts in a very clearly way. So in order to do that, he or she will have to acquire a specific language supported task type. So they have to explain things in a very easy way. Use different forms of interaction and be able to use appropriate classroom language. We will see some examples afterwards, like, for example, how am I going to explain this? How am I going to clarify? How paraphrasing? How am I going to recast what the students say in Spanish? And I'm going to explain that in English. How am I going to justify something? So remember that teachers are role models for the students. So they are going to follow what we do. And we have to show them how to do things and how to and support them in order to carry out and to progress in their learning. Then what about the students? What kind of challenges do they have to tackle with, do they have to cope with? Students need to receive an appropriate input, but at the same time, they have to produce something. So input is important, but output as well. So remember that one of the characteristics of CLIL is that students have to put into practice what they learn while they are learning. So it's not doing something today and practice it 2 weeks before. So remember that we learn by experiencing. So we learn to ride a bike by riding a bike. We learn to play the piano by playing the piano, not just by looking at the piano we have in the living room or having a look at the bicycle we have in our terrace. So input is important, but remember that that input has to be comprehensible. So it doesn't matter how much time they are exposed to the target language. If the message they receive is not meaningful, this input is not going to become intake. So the input has to be comprehensible. And of course, we have to provide our students with possibility to put into practice what they are learning. Now, the tasks have to be appropriate. They have to be used to the kind of tasks they have to do. And of course, we have to provide them with the necessary support so they can develop both cognitive skills and the academic language in that content. And you're going to say, how am I going to do this? Well, I'm not going to explain in depth what CLIL is, because, well, perhaps you already know it. But CLIL is based on the 4 C's, on 4 principles, which are content, communication, cognition, and culture. And these 4 C's and these 4 pillars work as a gear, and they have to be interrelated. Otherwise, CLIL, otherwise CLIL doesn't work very well. So remember, content, communication, cognition, and culture are completely interrelated. And as I was saying before, you say, well, how am I going to do that? That must be terrible. Well, remember, don't panic. There are many things we can do as teachers in order to help our students. So how can all these issues be tackled? So these issues can be tackled providing students with a lot of help, providing our students with a lot of assistance and support, giving them tips, giving them pieces of advice, and giving them a lot of guidance. So when you see this and you see the words that appear in here, help, assistance, support, teams, I suppose that the first word that comes into your mind is scaffolding. You're right. In order to tackle with all these issues, in order to provide our students with the necessary support so they can develop communication skills, cognitive skills, and they can have access to the content, we have to use a lot of scaffolding strategies. We are going to see a few of them, but there are many, many, many others. For example, a very good scaffolding strategy, especially when you're planning a lesson, is activating your students' prior knowledge or background knowledge. So by doing this, what I know is how much my students know about the topic I'm going to introduce in the classroom. So I know where to start from. How can you activate students' prior knowledge? There are many different ways you can do that. You can ask them questions. You can, set kind of a Kahoot quiz, so they have to answer some questions. You can use Socrative. There are many, many different ways to activate your students' prior knowledge. You can show them flashcards, etc. Another scaffolding strategy, which is going to help students or facilitate students' achievement, is, for example, breaking a complex task into many different steps. So doing things step by step, in more doable steps. Offering hints or partial solutions to problems. Asking questions while reading to encourage deeper investigation of concepts. Then we are going to see a table in which you will see what kind of scaffolding strategies you can use if you want to develop listening, or if you want to develop speaking or writing or reading. But asking questions is vital, is paramount in order to develop cognition in your students. This is something which is interesting in the sense when students contribute their own experiences, related with the topic you are dealing with, this is interesting because they feel part of the learning process. They feel part of what you're doing with them when you allow them to talk about their own experiences. using graphic organizers, using frameworks in order to assimilate new information. Graphic organizers are very, very important because they are very visual and they provide students with a lot of information in very simple ways. There are many different types of graphic organizers depending on what you want to do with them. So one of the main characteristics and things you have to take into consideration when you are planning in a CLIL unit is you have to provide students with the necessary support so they can develop communication and cognition in order to access the content. The input they receive has to be meaningful. If it is not meaningful, that input won't become intake. So this is a very important thing when you plan in a CLIL context. So support to the students, input, comprehensible input, so that input will become intake. Now, how can I plan in a CLIL context? What are the steps I have to follow? So this image is very representative in the sense that that woman is thinking about, okay, how am I going to plan? Remember that planning in general, it doesn't matter whether you do it in English or in Spanish or in anything. I mean, it's a thinking process. Planning is for you teachers to know how you're going to develop your lesson. And there are many questions you will have to ask yourself before having the actual plan. Now, in a CLIL unit, here you've got a scheme of what the things you have to take into consideration when you are planning in a CLIL unit. So some of the things are very, very similar to the ones you have to do when you are planning in the L1. But here we are going to see the 4 C's. Of course, every lesson plan has teaching objectives, and of course they have learning outcomes, what my students will know or will have learned at the end of the lesson, of the unit. The content would be the specific topics: science, biology, vertebrates, or history, or whatever. Cognition. Here, cognitive skills are divided into hots and lots, or lots and hots. And it has to do with the different types of activity you are going to propose your students, or the different types of questions you are going to ask your students while doing the different activities, or while you are presenting the unit. Communication has to do anything that has to do with the language. It will be within or inside communication. So what vocabulary do my students need in order to learn the content? Do I have to, grammar, discourse structures, or the different functions? Am I going to develop listening, speaking, scaffolding strategies? Everything that is related with language will be within communication. And of course, I will have to connect my unit with culture. Cultural aspects such as for society, students' life, on experiences, etc. So this would be the plan, or the steps you will have to follow when you are planning in a CLIL context. We are going to have a look now at the kind of questions you have to ask yourself before planning the unit. For example, as for the content, first of all, you have to think about, what am I going to teach? How am I going to do it? Do I want my students to write something? Is this going to be delivered orally, or is it going to be a text they will have to read? My teaching objectives, the learning outcomes we've talked about. What kind of activities will motivate my students? There are many things I can do in order to motivate my students. So you can teach a subject, but using materials that are really interesting for your students. As for communication, you will have to think about all this before planning your unit. So how will they produce and communicate the language, the content, and language of the lesson? Shall I have to cover any particular grammar point? What specific vocabulary do I have to select? What kind of activities am I going to use? Do I want my students to discuss about something? Do I want my students to do an activity in which they have to compare or contrast? Do I want them to classify something? Remember, this is all related with the functions of language. And then about cognition. what kind of questions am I going to ask them? For example, we're talking about activating students' prior knowledge at the beginning. So what kind of questions am I going to ask them to see how much they know, or to introduce the unit? You will have to think about questions questions that go beyond display questions, not just yes or no questions. If you want to develop higher thinking in your students, the questions will have to be more difficult. It's not just saying what color is this, blue but you can ask question about what would you do in case of developing higher order thinking skills. And of course, as for culture, what are the cultural implications of the topic? So nowadays, if we are talking, for example, about the environment, I mean, there are a lot of cultural implications in any unit. And of course, you will have to think, how am I going to connect this with the rest of the SIS? So this is the kind of questions I would ask myself as a teacher before planning a CLIL unit. Communication is very important. I said before that they have to know a lot of things. They have to know that, I mean, they have to receive input, but they have to be able to produce something. In order to do that, they have to be able to use different functions of language. And these functions of language are connected with cognition at the same time. My students will have to know how to give examples, how to describe a process, how to express conditions, how to talk about a purpose. So a lot of how to define something, expressing their own ideas, opinions, agreeing or disagreeing, etc. And I, as a teacher, will have to know how to make them practice with that language that will make things easier for them in order to learn what I want them to learn, of course. For example, imagine that I want my students to classify something. These are the kind of questions I would ask them. How would you classify this? How many kinds of whatever are there? Who can classify this or that? So here you've got an example of different questions you as a teacher can ask your students about classifying. But then if I want them to know how to classify things, a scaffolding strategy, which is very useful, is to create a substitution table. As you can see in this one, you have different columns, and you can practice in advance. If you want your students to classify something, you can make them practice in advance making sentences. And the only thing they have to do is to take one word from each of the columns, and they will be able to make a sentence. For example, there are many kinds, types, forms, or there are many classes of mammals, or there are many categories of reptiles. Another possibility would be mammals can be divided into different categories, or amphibians fall into many categories. As you can see, they are practicing with the language before you do something, so they will be able to produce something. It's not only the input you are providing them with the questions we've seen in the previous slide, but at the same time you are making them produce something. So remember, input and output. Substitution table can be very simple depending on the level of your students. You can have just 3 different columns, or they can be as complex as you really want. This is just an example of how you can develop communication with your students if you want them to produce and to put into practice things related with the content. As I said before, there are different scaffolding activities or strategies or techniques. They are not activities, sorry. Different strategies, techniques you can use depending on whether you are working at the word level, sentence level, or text level. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here because I think this session is being recorded, so you will have time to have a look at it afterwards if you have any doubts. But for example, if you want to promote listening in your students, these are the kind of scaffolding strategies you can use. First of all, highlighting or teaching vocabulary. This is going to be very useful for them, so they won't have problems understanding the reading afterwards. Giving them examples, summarizing something in a very simple sentence. That's at the word level. For example, at the text level, using visuals, explaining, summarizing. As we have seen before in the substitution label, at the speaking level would be asking questions, but you have to be sure that they will be able to answer. Providing them with substitution tables, giving them sentence starters. You give them the beginning of a sentence so they will be able to finish it. At the reading level, when you want to, with the reading scale, thinking aloud strategy is very useful to make them think. Thinking aloud strategy is you as a teacher, and when you are reading something, you create questions about, well, I think talking about prediction, I think the end of this story is not going to be very nice, or I think the main character is a bit worried. What do you think about it? I mean, you as a teacher make questions to make them think. Using cognates is a very good one in order to, when you adapt something to make things understand. Cognates are words which are quite similar in English and in English in Spanish. And of course, well, modeling, writing frames. If you provide them with a writing frame, they just have to fill it in, then they will be able to produce write an essay or whatever. So giving support is very important I would say not only in CLIL. Anyway, anything you do with your students has to be supported. We have talked about graphic organizers, and I said before that graphic organizers are very visual. I mean, the students have a lot of information in front of them, and they don't have to read a lot. If I want them to know that animals are classified according to, they can be vertebrates or invertebrates, and I give them some examples. It's very visual. There's something they've got in front of them. They don't have to read a long text. Or if I want them to talk about a process, a timeline is perfect. First, second, third, the different steps they have to follow. It's very visual. They just have to write a sentence underneath, and they have all the information in front of them, and it's going to make things easier for them, so they can understand it. Here we've got an example of a process, photosynthesis, which is something they study when they are in the first grade, when they are in the second grade, in the third grade. They study it over and over again. And as you can see here, in this picture, we've got the different steps a plant follows in order to do the photosynthesis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different steps, and very simple sentences and a visual. So nobody will have a problem understanding how photosynthesis works. This, of course, can be adapted if you want to. And instead of the plant draws up water, you can change it for the plant takes water from the ground. And I need to see if they have understood how the process works. Then provide them with a frame in which they will have to write how the process is, a timeline. First, this is what the plant does. This is the second thing. This is the third. And of course, you will have to think about connectors. First, second, then finally, after that, etc. So grammar is at the same time included. Now we are going to have a look at, very briefly, at a geography lesson. So as you can see, this one has not been organized according to the outline I showed you at the beginning about how CLIL is. So I've done it in a simpler way. I've got here what the learning outcomes are, what I want my students to know at the end of the unit. We're going to talk about the different climates in Europe. I want them to describe, so they will be able to describe and explain facts, to locate different climates on a world map. What am I going to do in order to activate their prior knowledge? A very simple question. Without looking at the map, tell me the names of 6 European countries you can think of. This is just an example of one thing I'm going to ask them. I can ask them many other questions. What about the language? What language do I want them to use, or which language is necessary for them to access the content? Mediterranean climates, the climate is found. This country is located in Southern Europe. Continental climate consists mainly of, for example, etc. What are the resources I'm going to use? Well, in this case, I'm going to use a video. I'm going to use maps of Europe, as many things as you can. And of course, my students are going to be assessed. On how to report facts about a location, describe places, give examples, etc. Now, how can we do this? Things can be done in many different ways, and not everybody does it exactly in the same way. I'm not saying that what I'm going to show you is the best way. Of course, there are many others, but you have to be very careful, and you have to think about all the things I have previously told you. So all the support you have to provide your students. Remember that they are still learning. Sometimes they are still learning their mother tongue. So imagine how much support they need in order to learn the second. There are things like, for example, words or language they already know, which is content compatible language. So remember that many of the things they know in the L1, in their mother tongue, is going to be transferred to the second one. This is one of the iceberg theory by Cummings. So many of the things they know in the first language is going to be transferred to the second. And there are many words they already know that are going to be useful for the new content you are going to teach them. There are words like summer, winter, cold, rain, high, low temperature, mountain, and snow. They already know because they have been using to talk about the weather in their English classrooms. But there are others which are content obligatory, which are specific for the content I'm going to teach them. Some of them are very similar to the Spanish ones. Remember, I was talking about cognates, oceanic, oceanico, nearly the same, continental, exactly the same, precipitation, very similar to the Spanish word, vegetation, etc. And then we've got other words like bushes, meadows, which are the kind of vegetation they are going to find in the different areas of Europe. How can we do this? I can do this in many different ways. And nowadays you are very lucky because there are a lot of activities, there are a lot of materials, there are a lot of videos in the internet that is going to help you with your classroom. But remember that sometimes some of them are meant for native speakers. So they will have to be adapted in some way. For example, one thing which I don't really like would be to show them this. Okay, we can study the different climates in Europe, and I can show them, of course, a map of Europe. And here we've got a lot of text. Boring, isn't it? Yes, very boring. There is a lot of things they will have to read. Perhaps there are words they're not going to understand. Or we can do it by showing them, sorry, I have to escape. I don't know what's happening. Okay, or I can show them a video. And this video is about 3 minutes. I hope we will have time to see it. And it's going to explain in a very visual way and using very, not very long sentences at all, and very specific words, how the climate is, or what the weather is like in the different European countries. We are going to have a look at it. So first of all, as you can see, it's showing the Mediterranean climate. And it's really, I mean, it's a very friendly video. They are going to understand perfectly what the weather is like, or what kind of climate we've got in Mediterranean countries. It's using all the time the same icons for temperature, for precipitation, etc. high in summer, mild in winter. Vegetation is very varied. We have many different types of vegetation. So in the same way that while you are reading something, you can stop reading and ask them questions, that's something you can do with a video at the same time. You can stop the video and ask them questions. So are the temperatures very, very high in winter, or are they very high in summer? Or what are temperatures like in summer in Mediterranean countries? Does it rain a lot? What kind of vegetation do we have? Do we have just one thing, or do we have many different types of vegetation? So there are questions you can be asking at the same time you're watching the video or just stopping it. So the icons are exactly the same. So we've got temperature, precipitation. You can use rain, does it rain, or precipitation, which are content obligatory language. They have to know. And as you can see, the words are quite similar. So we have abundant, it means it rains a lot. And the vegetation is not the same as in Mediterranean countries. We have a lot of meadows. We have oaks. Now, what about continental? For example, here precipitations are, they have a lot of precipitations in summer, and as you can see, the vegetation is completely different. It's very cold in mountain climate, very, very cold in winter, and in summer it's not very warm. And you can even talk afterwards, you can do activities in which the student will have to compare the climate in mountain places and the climate in Mediterranean places. So there are so many things you can do just by watching the video or after watching the video. So polar is like in Spain, they know that in polar climate must be very, very cold. It snows a lot. The temperatures are normally below zero. It doesn't rain much, but it snows very much and very often. And then we've got subtropical climate, which are the Canary Islands only. And they don't tell us anything about it. Exactly in the same way that I showed you before some substitution table to practice with communication. You can create one in order to talk about climates. So we've got the different types of climates we have seen, if you remember at the beginning in the unit, this is the main language I want them to use. Climate is found, is mainly found, consists mainly of, etc. There are, for example, bushes, corks, pine trees, lichens, meadows. You can provide them with different pictures so they will understand what a bush is, or what a pine tree is, or what a meadow is. And I will make them practice in advance after watching the video with these sentences. So Mediterranean climate is mainly found on western sides of the continent, or oceanic vegetation consists mainly of, etc. So I'm providing them with the structures they really need and the vocabulary which is specific for the content they have to learn. I have to go very quickly because I think I'm running out of time. Of course, what about the thinking and learning skill? What about developing different cognitive skills? Of course, I can ask very low order questions, or questions that belong to the low order thinking skills, or very high order thinking skills questions. And of course, as you can see here in the table, all the questions have a purpose. If I ask them what are the main characteristics of mountain climate, I'm just reviewing the learning to see how much they have learned, or even checking understanding. And if I ask them a question which is more difficult and that is going to make them think more, why do you think there is not much vegetation in tundra climates? I'm trying to evaluate what they have learned, and I'm trying to make them justify something or reasoning something. So as you can see, and as I said before, communication and cognition are really interrelated. If I want them to give me a reason to justify something, the critical thinking, the cognition, or they have to think much more about it. It's much more difficult. Or if I want them to hypothesize about something, remember that all this, when you develop higher order thinking skills or lower order thinking skills, it has to do as well with the kind of activities you create. So it's not the same if you create something in which they have to match a sentence with a word, or if you want them to evaluate something, to justify or to hypothesize what would you do in this situation, or imagine that they have to create something from something they have seen in the classroom. So this implies higher order thinking skills. Different types of activities or tasks you can do in this geography lesson. Very simple one: classify different types of habitats or climates. We haven't seen animals, but we have seen vegetation. Compare and contrast places or regions. Of course, you will have to think about the language they need in order to compare and contrast. They are both, unlike this one, etc. They can describe landscapes, they can label. As you can see, comparing and contrasted is much more difficult, the language they need, than label or matching diagram or maps. Web search, different games, jigsaw maps, lots and lots of activities, and I suppose you know many others. So why is planning important? Planning is important for you teachers because you will be able to anticipate your students' problems. You know your students, you know that you will have to create different activities for the different learning styles you've got in a classroom, but by thinking about how you're going to do it, and by thinking of how you're going to implement the communication, how do you want them to develop communication, cognition, things will be easier for them. You will be able to carry out a curriculum subject teaching. You will be able to identify the communication language they need. Remember, we have seen that there are things they already know, and there are things, specific things, which are new for them. What kind of teaching strategies do you need? That's important. What other teaching strategies we have seen before? What kind of support I'm going to give my students so they can carry out the different activities? This is the same, sorry, repeated. And of course, you will be able to prepare appropriate and meaningful materials and activities. As I said before, now we are very lucky because there are a lot of things in the internet that can give us a lot of ideas to carry out different tasks, to create different materials, to create different activities. So these are the references I have used in order to show you or to do this session. And here you've got my email address, my Twitter as well. And now this is the end. Thank you very much. And now I'm ready. I'm ready to answer any questions you want to make. Well, I leave you here. Well, this is the cover of a book I published 2 years ago. And if you want to understand what CLIL is in a very easy way, because, well, I thought about it, I read a lot it, and I think it's difficult when you go into very theoretical things. You've got here like kind of a summary about CLIL, and at the end you've got a very useful, I think the most useful things in the book is a unit completely developed. So in case you want to see, so you will see different writing frames, how to develop cognition, how to develop communication, etc. Well, there you have it, just for you to have an idea. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm ready for your questions.